Well, welcome everybody. We'll start in a moment. I'm Robert Klitzman, and I direct the Masters of Bioethics program here, and we're delighted to have you all here. And I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet. If you could just put your name and your email address and your affiliation, that would be great, and we can make sure you get announcements of our other upcoming events. So I'm going to pass that around. And I'm delighted to have with us this evening Dr. Llew Keltner, who is the president of Light Sciences Oncology, which is a biotech company. And he is also someone who is interested in bioethics and appreciates bioethics and has done extraordinary work doing clinical trials of important treatments for cancer around the world, in China, here, elsewhere. And is a busy man, always on the road, so we're delighted to have you here for a conversation. And we are taping the event, and what we're going to do is post it on the website, because often people want to come to these events and can't, and some people working, and we thought this way people in the future could get a sense of the kinds of ways in which we explore bioethics in different contexts. So, thanks. Great. So, and we welcome your questions. So I thought we would have this as an informal conversation, and I'd ask Dr. Keltner a few questions, and then if you have any questions at any point, feel free to ask, and then we'll open the floor up at the end as well. So I thought I'd start just by maybe if you could say a little bit about the kind of work you do and your company does, and then...
Sure. I'm a physician, trained as a physician in oncology, and I have spent most of my career, however, in business, in building companies in health sciences, both in biotechnology, drug development, medical device development, and some health service and informatics companies. So I actually am a career CEO. I run various companies. And the company that I literally have just finished running, and Bob wasn't even aware, I've moved to a new venture now. The company I've just finished running is called Light Sciences Oncology. We were developing a new cancer therapy, which has completed a couple of phase 3, or the last stage of clinical trials. We were doing these trials quite globally, with sites in the two trials combined in 32 countries. So we were not working in South America, and we were not working in Africa. We did have one trial site in Cairo, which is closed about 6 months ago. But we were working on every other continent and many countries. So the challenges of doing those trials has been very interesting, and the ethical issues sometimes are intriguing and challenging.
So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, and what kinds of ethical issues have you seen or run into?
One of the most obvious, and one of the ones that hits the press, is that there are countries, and I don't mind talking about them, China and Russia are the two most serious, where we get approached on a quite frequent basis when we go to meet with potential clinical investigators, principal investigators at clinical sites, which usually are hospitals in oncology, where we are offered data. In other words, we're offered data for money, and it's blatant. We'll visit a place, they'll show us what they've done, what clinical trials they participated in, everything looks great. We'll go out for a nice dinner, and sometime during the dinner, someone will say, "Well, we know you want the trial to be successful." Yes. Well, we can help a great deal. And the offer is made to manufacture data. Now, I'm not saying this always happens, but it is not rare, unfortunately. And so it is obviously the potential impact on patients of a drug being approved with manufactured data. Now, I can believe in a product as much as I want. I can believe in a product far more than the clinical data from a trial will ever show, because clinical trials, in the way they're designed, truly sometimes make the actual potential impact of a product look very tiny, whereas the actual clinical impact may be huge. Even though I know that that's probably the case because I'm intimately involved in the product, I may have invented it and developed it, it's the potential impact on a patient population of using a product that has been approved based on phony data even if it's partially phony data. You can all imagine it's enormous. So to me, the ethical issue, it's not, oh, is it wrong or right to use fake data? Sure, it's wrong, but that's not the issue. The issue is, what's the potential impact of doing that with the drug I'm working on? But worse, what's the potential impact on huge patient populations if we as investigators in the field allow this to go on? And by allowing it to go on, trial after trial, drug after drug, allowing it to become institutionalized, then basically, as citizens in whatever country where these drugs are used, what's drug regulation about? We can all argue about whether the FDA should be there, what its role should be. That's a different story. But the fact is, that's the system we have. It is designed specifically to protect the safety of the public. And so if there's an institutionalized bias that's in there that really makes that process not work correctly, what do we have? We have drugs being marketed that the general public, mainly the unscientifically educated public who can't read the articles themselves because they don't have the skill or the access, that people are using drugs which are fundamentally based on an incredibly flawed concept. Now, that's really unethical. It's unethical of any of us involved in the industry to not do whatever we can to try to stop it. I have ethical dilemmas in that situation in sometimes not reporting it. Now, in a country like China, if we report it, then we'll not be allowed to do clinical trials anywhere in the country ever again. End of story. In Russia, if we report it, we may not get out of the country alive. I have a colleague who did in fact lose his life in Russia over this issue, literally, 6 months ago. We assume he lost his life. He was within 6 hours of making a report to the federal government in Russia of a situation like this, he disappeared. But I do the same thing. You don't have any choice. It has to be done. So there are a lot of ethical dilemmas in regard to the way clinical trials are conducted. There are other ethical dilemmas in international clinical trials in terms of patient access. The reality is, very often in other countries, especially in undeveloped countries, Philippines is a good example. We had a clinical trial site in the Philippines for our oncology trial, partially because of disease incidents, but partially because of access to patients, where virtually everyone involved in the clinical trial would not have been able to pay for any care of any kind for their liver cancer had they not been involved in the clinical trial. So the ethical issue is the clinical trial then, and the company that I run was paying for their care, whether they were in the treatment group or the control group, right? So they were getting care, and the patients that were randomized to control were getting life-saving care, which had a high probability of extending their lives. So we had no problem ethically randomizing and putting people in a control group because they were getting care. They would not have been able to afford any care otherwise. So that wasn't the issue. But the issue then is, what do you do when the trial's over? Now, the day the trial's over and the protocol's been specified and the FDA rules have been satisfied, but these patients have come to you for care. Well, what do you do? In the treatment group, you cannot continue, by law, we cannot continue to offer them the experimental therapy. Can't be done. It's done, the experimental therapy has to be cut off. But then those patients have no therapy, and the patients in the control group, we also have the right to terminate the therapy at that time, and that's usually how it's done. But wait a second. These are people whose lives may already have been extended by care, and further care is liable to continue to extend their lives. And so, to be honest, in the companies that I run, I always build into budgets continued care for these patients until they either withdraw from the care or they die, which in oncology, since very often we do our clinical trials in groups of patients that have diseases with an extremely short median survival, it's unfortunately not very long until most of the patients die. But again, it's a serious ethical issue, which is not commonly considered. I do get criticized a lot. There are a lot of bankers and folks that kind of laugh about it. And why do you do that? You don't have to do that. You don't have to spend the money on the patients. No, we don't have to, but these are people who've come in to get care they couldn't otherwise pay for, and to then abandon them because it costs a few extra bucks. It's an issue. Those are a couple of the most serious issues, I think.
That's amazing. So for the first one, what about reporting it to the FDA or folks here? Is that an option, or
It's always done. That's mandated. As far as I'm concerned, it's mandated.
So one reports it here.
Oh boy, we report it in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
And it's not dangerous.
Right,
Not everyone
right.
does that. I think some people feel like, out of sight, out of mind. They may make the decision, we don't want to do our clinical trials here because we don't play that game.
Right.
But they usually don't report to the FDA. Anytime I've had knowledge of it happening in the clinical staffs that I control, oh man, written report goes to the FDA. In this case, with oncology products, we have a wonderfully receptive environment at the FDA. Dr. Pazder, who runs the Division of Oncology Products at the FDA, is a brilliant physician, deeply concerned about cancer patients. I know we all hear a lot of criticism about the FDA, but there are people there who really want folks to have access to drugs which will make them have better lives. And Pazder's, I think, on the top of that heap. And so, no, we have religiously reported, and we have a very receptive environment there. I can't tell you the outcome. That's not something that's communicated back to us. But I'm hoping that there's a good register there someplace, and when other people then list those sites as potential sites for their trial, I'm hoping that the agency steps forward and says, maybe you better think about that.
Right.
Yeah.
So how about if you were someone who's getting a master's in bioethics degree and is interested in working in industry? Any suggestions, thoughts, what things they might do?
Well, sure. I think that anyone who's developing drugs in the pharmaceutical industry, whether it's a large pharma company or it's a small biotech company, has a huge pile of ethical issues which they have to consider. Now, I don't believe that the industry in general does a particularly good job of this kind of thinking. The thinking is usually pretty technical and it's pretty narrow. We're doing this drug development. It's okay to do it. We need to race it forward. We need to push forward. Our financial backers are pushing us forward, and we need to get these drugs out there on the market. In general, I believe the industry has integrity in not trying to push forward therapies that they know are not liable to be good for patients. It's happened. There's no question that it's happened. And in the medical device business, there are companies who manufacture and sell therapies that they know are dangerous to patients, and they're happy to do it. I think in the drug development industry in general, that's not the case. I'm not saying these folks are all wonderful people, they're not. But in general, I think they're trying to develop drugs that will have a positive benefit on the population. But the consideration of ethical issues, even though public companies in particular may have ethical policies for how they do their business, how they make their decisions, it's kind of a rubber stamp. At the level of boards of directors of biotech companies and pharma companies, there are not often open, free-for-all discussions about the ethics of what's going on in the business. Companies where I sit on the board, we usually have those discussions, much to the chagrin of some of the other board members, because if I see something that I think we ought to discuss, not that I don't like particularly, but that we just better have the discussion, I'm going to bring it up. So what I'm getting at in response to the question is that there is a big hole. There is the need for folks who are truly well-trained in bioethics, who have studied the issues, who've looked at the issue from a number of different viewpoints, not just in a very narrow scientific technical viewpoint related to that one drug development area or that one medical device development area. There is an acute need for folks coming out of programs like this, an absolutely acute need. Now, are people offering to hire bioethicists? No. But I believe that political trends and social trends could clearly force that to happen. And frankly, I think as graduates of a program, if you have your credentials in order and you have your arguments in order, and if you walk into these companies and say, now listen, do you in fact have a bioethics officer? Do you in fact have someone who may be doing more than just bioethics, who may be doing writing for you, technical writing? I've got anybody who comes out of this program probably is a great technical writer. Now, you may not know technical writing in healthcare that well, but I'm telling you, you probably are a great technical writer. And so companies always need stuff like that to happen. So I think that the viewpoint of being able to go into a company, large or small, and say, now listen, I'm trained in bioethics. Here are the issues that you face, which you can develop that on your own. Here are the issues that you face. Do you have someone to deal with them? Do you have someone who's coordinating this work? Do you have someone to set up systems within your company so that the flow of these issues can be tracked, so that there really is a way that the company can step forward to the public and to its constituencies, which may be finance, which may be the FDA, which may be clinical investigators, and say, we actually have done our due diligence. We have someone inside the company or a consultant who is in fact working with us on these issues, and this is a regular part of our business. I don't know a single company in the industry that can say that today. Now, if you go to the really big pharma companies, they'll say, oh yeah, so-and-so's in charge. This is our compliance officer. The compliance officer has working for them a consulting firm or someone, and yeah, we consider those issues. But a specific person that focuses and whose job is to make sure that the systems are in place, the issues are considered, and that the company is repeatedly challenged on those issues, doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't exist, and that companies wouldn't listen, because I think the tide of public interest and the tide of regulatory interest and legal interest really pushes them in that direction. I think the need is there in some companies. I know many companies I'm involved with, other CEOs of companies I talk to about this issue, and they do nod their heads and say, we don't do a good job. That's correct. We don't do a good job, but what are we supposed to do? These folks with specific training in bioethics, as Bob knows better than anybody on the planet, are pretty rare. There aren't many of you out there.
So just to be concrete, so would someone look up a drug company online at jobs offered and look in the compliance office division or the president's division?
No, I'm really saying, I'm saying you look up a company online and you look at what they're doing and what drugs they're working with and what they're developing and where they're developing them, and you look at the press and find out what sorts of legal issues they've faced and what kind of regulatory flack they've taken and what kind of political flack they've taken, and you prepare an argument, and you go to, I think in this case, probably whoever is the either in charge of the external legal staff or the internal legal staff, which may be compliance, or it may be an internal, the company may have its own counsel. And you can go to the legal staff, and you get an appointment with somebody on that legal staff, and you sit down and say, now listen, here are the problems I think that you face, and how are you dealing with them? And frankly, I've got the background and skills. I could put a system together for you to deal with these issues.
Do law schools train people who are going into law to be sensitive to these issues?
I know there are some discussions in some law schools, but not very pointedly.
Up until this week, we've not had a health law person here.
Human rights advocacy. When you think about human rights organizations that do work to ensure access to medication, or to ensure that the human right to health is being upheld, but it's not. It's just kind of a pretty recent development in the industry in general of human rights and law schools.
Yeah, I mean, I know just because I have a lot of experience with it at Seattle University in the law school, there certainly are classes and folks who have a lot of expertise in healthcare access. Mm-hmm. So especially access of underserved populations to healthcare. And there are a fair number of students in each graduating class at Seattle University, just because of the orientation of that university, which is usually not just healthcare access, but access of underserved populations. There certainly are a number of people who come out of each class at Seattle University every year, the law school, who want to focus on healthcare access. And so, yeah, there's some training, and I think those folks often end up in those kinds of organizations. It's not quite the same. It's some focus, but it's a bit of a different twist. Although access is a huge ethical issue. In bioethics, it's a huge, huge issue.
Yeah, we
Is-
look at patent laws that just look for what changes in pharmaceuticals.
Oh, big changes. and you know, we've had this atomic bomb dropped in patent law, you know, in the last 60 days with the Obama administration's announcement that, well, we really don't think people should be able to patent naturally occurring genes. And I'm not commenting on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's going to have huge effects, and it may have effects on access. It may not. The industry may just figure out, oh well, there's a cheap workaround, which there is, but it's a big issue.
So the way that would affect access is what exactly, or how?
Well, there are. It could create a number of really big patent battles, or patents which are disallowed, existing patents which are disallowed by the USPTO, and that in fact then could result in patent lawsuits by competitors which force drugs off the market. That's quite possible. And there are a lot of folks in the industry who are frightened that that could actually happen, that it could create just an enormous patent war that in fact would cause some drugs to be pulled from the market, or companies to be much more hesitant about developing drugs that are based on genes or substances that have been taken from nature and patented, and they've licensed those patents. I mean, there are an untold number of companies that have in development drugs which are from nature, or they've taken genes which occur in nature and they've developed drugs based on those genes, and not just human genes, but other genes, and plants, animals. And so how will those companies move forward with the development of those drugs? And I know for a fact that there are folks in companies who are watching carefully what happens to this patent issue with the U.S. government, and if in fact the USPTO or the Congress or the administration comes down and says, no, we're drawing a line in the sand, any patents out there that are based on naturally occurring products are invalid. If it occurs in nature, you can't patent it. That's not non-obvious. It's nature's, it's not yours. If that happens, there are companies that will either stop or delay or deprioritize the development of specific products they have in development. Now, is that a bad thing? I'm not saying that's bad or good, but it will cause changes in new drugs moving through the pipeline.
So why don't we open it up? Other questions? Yes.
I just wondered what, it's kind of a two-part question, what your attitude towards state safety monitoring reports are, and what you think what other sponsors' attitudes towards state DSMBs are, and whether or not there are a lot of conflicts, and how you choose the members. That's one question. And then the second question, I'm not sure that you've ever even come across this, but if a study site actually collects data out of compliance, would you allow them to use that data, or would you use that data in the outcomes of the study, if the IRB agreed, or how would you make that decision?
Those are great questions. The first one on DSMBs, on data safety monitoring boards. I personally think a data safety monitoring board is extremely important. If, in fact, the folks on the data safety monitoring board truly are experts in the specific clinical area where the drug development is going on or the device development is going on, then if the charter of the DSMB is made reasonably wide instead of crammed down into sort of the legally mandated piece. The legally mandated piece very often is that a clinical trial protocol that's accepted by the FDA mandates that at certain times the DSMB review particularly the safety data and especially the SAE, the significant adverse event data, and has the ability to stop the trial or recommend to the company that they immediately inform the FDA and put the trial on clinical hold because there are untoward safety effects. The DSMB also often is required by the protocol to, in fact, look at the data at certain points and report on statistical significance of the data. So there are stopping rules for the trial so that if a trial reaches statistical significance or the treatment group actually is statistically significantly lower in response than the control group, that in fact the trial be stopped. That's the narrow version. If the charter is wider, and the sponsor has, beyond that narrow regulatorily defined charter, the company does have freedom. In the U.S., the sponsor has the freedom to expand the charter of the DSMB. So you can actually expand the DSMB charter so that the DSMB meets on a more regular basis. The DSMB actually has open philosophical discussions about content of the trial and what's going on in the trial. The DSMB can freely comment back to the sponsor about conduct of the trial. You can expand the DSMB charter if they will accept it to even actually have some site reviews. You can't make them site monitors, but you can actually request that in the charter that DSMB members make at least one site visit during the conduct of the trial, which I think is invaluable. Because many times since there's people who are skilled in the area, they're visiting with colleagues if they make site visits. They know the people in the sites. So sometimes they like it a lot. But I like the use of a DSMB that's a separate body, which, yes, is being paid by the company, but knows that it's fully independent and has an ability to report around the company to the regulatory agency in whatever country, and has a role that's extended far beyond just those very rigid data review responsibilities and responsibilities for safety review. So
DSMB stands for?
Data Safety Monitoring Board.
Does everyone know what a DSMB is? Well, why don't we just say a sentence?
Sure, and you know a lot about them. You may know better than I do what they are, but most clinical trials of medicines do require that there is a data safety monitoring board, which does do regular review of both the efficacy and safety data coming from the trial. Usually it is the data safety monitoring board that does have the authority to, again, tell the company that they need to inform the FDA, this is just the U.S. part, inform the FDA that the trial should be stopped or put on clinical hold because there are side effects, and these usually are very serious side effects, most often resulting in death, that were not expected and not planned, and that there needs to be further review of the therapy or the design of the trial before the trial continues. The Data Safety Monitoring Board then also usually has the responsibility for conducting a statistical analysis of the efficacy part of the data at specified points in the trial and at the end of the trial, and reporting that data then back to the sponsor for the sponsor to make decisions about regulatory submissions, about continuing the trial.
Right. And the other key thing is if I'm conducting the trial, I don't know who gets placebo versus active medication or which of the active medications. So it's a double-blind study. I don't know, and the people don't know. The DSMB unblinds a study. So they see who are getting the two different medications, and they see if one medication is clearly much better and the other one's horrible, they'll say, stop the study.
Yeah, and the DSMB, again, there are some variations in charters, but the right way to do it with the DSMB is that the DSMB doesn't actually unblind. The data that the data flow that the DSMB gets is always open. So it's not a question of at specific times they rip the label off and look at the data. If you do the DSMB right, any day of the week, the DSMB can get into current data, current as of that day, and they know who's treated with what. They can actually do case review. So to the DSMB, there isn't any blinding of study data if you do it correctly. Now, many people don't do that. They have the DSMB meet. The FDA will have specified interim looks at the data at a couple of points or even more points during the conduct of the trial. The DSMB meets usually within about 30 days of the time that event occurs. Whatever patient event triggers that interim look, the DSMB meets then, goes over the data, then has a meeting with the company staff, usually the company clinical staff, and then recommends specific things to the company. But that's actually usually how it's done, but I don't like it. I like the DSMB to be far more engaged, which I think was your question. So the composition of DSMBs then, as far as I'm concerned, needs to be, they must be experts in the clinical area. They must be folks who are well respected in the clinical area, and that's sometimes another ethical issue. Folks that write a lot of articles aren't necessarily the best clinicians in the area, but they have to be people who are respected. There also has to be a statistical leader of every DSMB who manages that statistical analysis. And depending on the clinical field, that gets really narrow. In oncology, for example, there is a person who you always go at, one guy who you always go after. And then down here, there's another group, and then down here, there are unknowns. So it's really narrow. I mean, literally, there's one guy who's the king. And you really try to get him on as your statistical advisor for your DSMB, because if you do, your fate with the FDA is different. So in other areas, it's wider. There's a wider group of people who you can pull in as the statistical advisor. It just really depends on the field. And I'm sorry, what was the second question?
If data is collected out of compliance,
Right.
if they don't have a current IRB approval and enroll the subject and collect the data, what's your sense on whether or not you use that data? Do you rely on the IRB that's reviewing the compliance concern? And if they agree that the data could be used, will you allow it? I mean, it's a tricky. I work for an IRB, so it's a tricky thing for us to deal with when data is collected. The argument is, if we don't use the data, the subjects who consented to, or the subject, it's really a shame for the subjects who actually participated and now they underwent some sort of risk, and we're not going to use that data. Yet the other side is, well, you didn't do it when you had IRB approval, and that's another issue.
Well, to be honest, in an ideal world, I think, and the way I like to operate it, is that the sponsor has absolutely no decision-making power. None. Zero. The sponsor has no decision-making power about whether the data from a particular patient be used or not. That it is entirely in the hands of, yes, the IRB, but more importantly, the centralized independent agency which is doing the data monitoring. So the data monitoring statistical agency, which may be a part of the clinical research organization that's used, it may be a separate agency, but there should be a party that's got the rules in their hand. It filters through that party, and if the rules aren't satisfied, data aren't used. Now, that's not how it really always works. With some trials with particular medicines, that actually works very well. In some trials with particular medicines, especially complex therapies, oncology is a great field where this is the case, because the therapies are complex and the patient's responses are all over the map and the safety issues are extreme. Then yes, you get very great situations. You get an investigator who gets a little bit enthusiastic and, was the remaining liver function really 50% or was it 48% or, gosh, there are different ways we can interpret this lab test. And so I guess the bottom line answer to your question is it's not always black and white, but in general, I really like to see the sponsor pushed as far away from that decision as possible. Not to get the responsibility away from the sponsor, but the reality is that the sponsor has obviously a financial temptation, and in some cases a really striking financial temptation to use that data. And the sponsor,
or to not use the data.
well, the sponsor theoretically shouldn't know whether the data point is positive or negative for their final approval. But clearly, the sponsor in every case has spent a huge amount of money gaining that data point from that patient, no matter what the trial is of any medication. It's really expensive. So that data point's expensive, and if you don't use it, the consequences can be incredible. And we've had very tangible examples in cancer trials I've been involved with recently, where in fact, every one of those data points is really valuable. And oncology trials tend to be small, so you're pushing the statistical analysis very tightly. So do you put 400 people in the trial, or do you put 500 people in the trial? For a small company developing a drug, you may be able to afford 400. You can't afford 500. The statistical model calls for 400 people, but wait a second. What if? Well, if your data monitoring group, not the data monitoring committee, but the independent data monitoring group and data assessment group comes to you and says, we are not happy with the way the analysis was done of the CTs or the MRIs with this particular patient. We believe it may be pushing the compliance envelope, so this patient may not go in. Or we have found that the CT read by the investigator does not agree with the CT read at central radiology, which is an enormous problem in oncology trials. It always happens. And so then you start losing numbers, and all of a sudden your initial statistical model was incorrect. And in many cases, this is very common in oncology trials, for the first indication of cancer therapy, it turns out you never actually can reach the final event according to the protocol because you lose too many folks because of data which is, now, very rarely is it, I have rarely found it questionable because an investigator has misperformed. It's simply because stuff happens, you know, and there's different interpretation of tests and different and timing, and gee, we scheduled the patient, but you know, we randomized the patient. I've seen this. We randomized the patient 6 hours before we actually had the IRB document in our hand. Now, if you do that, if the patient gets randomized in because the nurse and the doc really, you know, have a lineup and they're chafing at it, and they randomize the patient literally 6 hours, and you go back and do the chart review and the data review, the site monitor goes in and says, wait a minute, this says 8 a.m. And I've got in my records that we didn't have that letter in hand from the IRB until 2 p.m. That data shouldn't be used. Now, from what you say is a patient standpoint, is that ethical for the patient? You know, the patient went through all the agony and family conversations and should I participate and maybe reading and studying, and you know, it's sometimes really agonizing to participate in a clinical trial, and hopes have been generated, and then you call the patient up and say, oh, sorry, we're kicking you out of the trial because the nurse signed you up 6 hours before legally we were supposed to do it. That's a problem. So I don't have a solid answer for you. It's just that I think the sponsor shouldn't be in that game, if possible.
Questions? Adira?
I was wondering a little bit about personalizing the patient when the patient's de-identified for the sponsor or the pharmaceutical company. So I know that there's the public face of the patient that sometimes happens at the testimony of FDA advisory board meetings when the patients have gone through the clinical trial. We talk about the effects of the drug and things like that. And I know that we have this right to privacy and respect, and also federal regulations that sort of guard us from ever having the identity of the patient sort of disclosed in any sort of formalized way. So I was thinking a little bit about the public perception of pharmaceutical companies as like this terrible giants and, you know, poor clinical trial patients or research patients. But I'm wondering if there's ever any attempt to sort of connect the personal stories and the clinical trial patients, good or for better or for worse, with sponsors. If there's ever some outreach that's done to try to see if people are willing to be de-identified, to have conversations about their experiences with clinical trials or their experiences with drugs, or if the only really real interface between the actual patients who have gone through this or the subjects that have gone through this and pharmaceutical companies happens at the FDA level.
It's a great question, and my answer is probably at a pretty radical end of the spectrum. Yeah, it happens, and I think it's always for bad reasons. There's a case that happened, my memory's probably going to be bad here, but I guess it would have been 7 years ago, where ImClone, a biotech company in New York, fought a battle on the front pages of the New York Times for approval of their drug Erbitux, which is a cancer therapy, and in fact named the patient, had quotes from with the patient's consent. You know, I took this drug and my life was saved, and on and on. It may have all been true, but as far as I'm concerned, you know, that it was done because the FDA had given the company a complete response letter, which basically means we're not going to approve your drug unless you do X, Y, and Z. Further trials usually, which is a huge cost for a biotech company. Sometimes it's beyond the ability of the company to do it. And so that trial got prosecuted on the front page of the New York Times with patient testimonials. Now, sorry, I think that's just way over the pale. That's not the way you do your regulatory work. That's, you know, you don't do that so that you can line up congressmen and patient advocacy groups and folks to call the FDA and say, you people are criminals, you know, what are you doing? You can't do this. Look at this poor woman, or she's alive now 2 years later when she wouldn't have been. It's wrong. Sorry, I think it's just black. It's wrong. Now, what you're talking about sometimes is trying to personalize the face of the experience of clinical trial patients. I think because it may in fact change the public's perception about the whole industry, I think it's very dangerous because it always can gravitate over into promotional activity, and on the face of it, it's liable to be a promotional activity. And the pharmaceutical and biotech industries are, to me, stunningly too promotional. There are companies that really do toe the line and are really, really careful about being promotional. But boy, oh boy, I mean, there's just an awful lot of our peers who are strikingly promotional. And, you know, they're selling their drugs in the press. I mean, and I'm not being facetious. They're selling their drugs in the press before they've ever gotten out of mice. And it's not okay. It's not okay to put out press releases that make claims. And by the way, it's legal to do that. You know, if I've got a drug, if I've got a company and we've developed a drug and we've got mouse data, I can put out a press release that says, you know, this is a new breakthrough in cancer. You know, this may really change the way cancer patients' lives work. Now, the second that goes into human clinical trials under an FDA-approved protocol, you know, the FDA is going to, that's it, if I do that. But before it goes into humans, and people do it all the time. It's all the time we see it, especially in the UK. In the UK, you can almost expect it. Anytime a company has a piece of mouse data or E. coli data in the lab, you're going to see an article in the British press that says cure for cancer found. It's just guaranteed.
What's the explanation for that? Why
Oh.
is it prevalent more in the UK than in other countries?
I have a guy who runs clinical trials for me who lives in the UK, who has given me long explanations about the fundamental fallacy of the British press. So I can't repeat all of it, frankly, but apparently it's an issue with just how the British press operates in general, not just in this area, but people are allowed to get away with that kind of promotional journalism. And in the U.S., you can pretty much get away with it. The nice thing about the U.S. is that when folks do it, somebody usually will stand up, and these days, just because the media has become something totally different than it was. You know, blogs actually have effect. You know, there'll be people within hours who are blogging and saying, "Wait a second, no, you can't do this. That's not what that data says." So, Jason, you have a question?
I was just wondering. I'm assuming those companies would say, like, part of the reason we have to do that early promotion is because we need to be able to build up hype around the new drug so that it pays for all the research that has to be done, and it's kind of this like long-term risk evaluation of and all the other drugs that may not end up eventually get passed by the FDA. And I'm guessing that sort of they would defend with this economics of we try to get so many drugs to market, only a few happen, and then we only have a certain amount of time where we have our intellectual property on the actual drugs. So we're trying to build up that marketing hype prior to it launching so that they can really make all that money back. And I don't know if you think that's...
Yeah, I think that's, yes, I think that's valid, but I think in new drugs, which often are developed in the early stages by biotech companies, it's even more basic than that. It's not, we're doing pre-marketing. What you're doing is you're raising money. You want the value of it to the venture capital community and to the public fund investor. If you're a public company, or you think you're going to be a public company, you want the potential value to look great. And so you hype your product as much as you can so you can raise money. And that's, it's wrong. It's just wrong. Sorry. Now, you can say, but wait a minute, this is a really important drug. What if we can't raise the money and get it out there to the market? Then the public won't have access to it. Well, tough, you know? Learn how to tell your story in an honest, straightforward way that says these are the risks, these are the realities, here's what we're trying to do, here's how we've designed our programs, you know, and this is what we think it might be able to accomplish, but we don't know. Here's some ideas that it may be able to help patients. We don't know. We don't have the data. That's why we're running clinical trials. That's the right way to do that. It's the right way to solve that problem and raise money. And I really believe companies that do that become known to the financial community for telling the story straightforwardly and honestly and not promoting, actually end up in a better place. But that's not obvious. And so I think a lot of people promote heavily so that they can raise money more easily first, but then the second point that you made about really pre-marketing, Yeah, I think that is involved, and certainly some of the bigger pharma companies with later stage trials, I think, have been badly guilty of doing pre-marketing promotion, especially since, again, it's one of these screwball timing issues. A pharmaceutical company, while a drug is in trial, can actually make comments about off-label uses of the drug. The second that NDA is approved, guess what? The FDA will kill you. I mean, you're dead meat if you make comments about off-label marketing. If you try to promote that drug for off-label uses in any way, you're dead. Yeah, I mean, CEOs literally have gone to jail for off-label promotion. And so, but before the thing's approved, when you're still in clinical trials, you can make comments about other potential uses. And pharmaceutical companies have been guilty of doing pre-approval off-label promotion through that very mechanism that you talked about. And is it wrong? Yeah, of course it's wrong. There's no reason for it. Again, you need to be rational and simply tell the story in a very clear, straightforward, rational way. And ultimately, if it's a good product, it should succeed in the marketplace. Although, again, I was meeting with a very experienced pharma and biotech PR person today who said, there's a lot of recent data that's come out. People have done a lot of studies, and the sales of drugs in the United States, the one factor that is most closely correlated with the increase in sales volume is, guess what? Anybody know? Minutes of TV advertising. It's not clinical trial results. It's not statements from experts. It's not whether your doctor likes the drug or not. It's minutes of freaking TV advertising. I mean, yeah, I sort of knew that, but it was a very depressing moment. So, anyway, so promotion obviously it does rule the day.
Yeah.
Amy?
Sort of along that point, I was wondering if you could talk about pharmaceutical companies' influence on academic medical journalism in terms of New England Journal, the upper tiers, and what you think that means for physicians, the larger medical practice, and whether you think there's a tension between companies selling, or I guess the journals selling ad space to pharmaceutical companies, or ghostwriting, sort of anything along influencing that in arguably deceitful way. I don't know what your perspective is on that.
Well, I guess that sort of the latter issue you raise of the advertising space issue in regard to what journals will publish and the amount of pressure that a ad buyer can exert on the journal. Frankly, I don't have direct personal experience with it, and I can't comment on it. I assume that it may be an issue. I've certainly seen people in print make all kinds of claims that it's an issue. I don't know that it's not an issue. It may be. Now, in terms of the issue of ghostwriting, but even more than ghostwriting, being that someone inside the company writes the scientific article, which then goes out under the authorship of a principal investigator in a trial, or a post-marketing, a person that's doing research, usually in another indication, but that the articles are written by the company. I think even more common than ghostwriting is just the pharmaceutical company or the biotech company actually doing direction of the content or general thrust or timing of the article, or even more important, the non-timing of the article by the investigator. So that I think it's quite real that there is a very conscious suppression of clinical trial results, negative clinical trial results. And what's the easiest way to get the clinical trial results suppressed? Just make sure that your principal investigators don't write it up. So you put in place as a company contracts with investigators that don't give the investigator publication rights. Now, frankly, I think that's unethical. That's a big bioethics issue to me. I know of only a couple of companies, and there may be more, but a couple of companies that write into their contracts with principal investigators that if the company doesn't publish the data, or doesn't make an active attempt to publish the data within a certain number of days or months of the time the data becomes available, that the investigator has partial ownership of the data, which means they can publish. And investigators clinical investigators usually, I believe, are people who care about the patients. And so if they do a trial and the results are negative, now in some countries that's different. In Japan, it's very, very different. In Japan, you do not publish negative results because the investigator's reputation suffers so dramatically if you publish negative results. But outside of Japan, in general, it's different. The investigator is more than happy and eager to publish negative results. But the company often doesn't want those results published, and so very often the articles just don't appear. And so that's an issue. Now, as far as influence of a company on the article, on the content, on the direction, I think it's incredibly pervasive. And you're probably aware that certainly in the press there's been a great challenge of ghostwriting, and the FDA has been asked to step in, so the FDA is investigating, and I think there will be rules that will come down this year, and when the FDA will specifically, will have a policy document that's issued about ghostwriting, and I don't know what part of the FDA might be charged with compliance, whether it's DDMAC or somebody else. I don't really know, but is that a good thing? I think it's too bad. I don't like more regulation. It's too bad for the FDA to have to step into that process, but it's not right for a company to ghostwrite an article and hand it to an investigator, and the investigator then issues the article. But it's, as far as I'm actually not aware, and even companies that I've been involved with, it's really, really hard to stop. And sometimes the investigators actually ask for it, because they want to publish a lot of stuff. So they say, oh, well, send me a draft. Well, it's your data, and you generated it, you really want to see it published, and the investigator is the PI in the study, the principal investigator, and they send you an email and they say, oh yeah, well, send me a draft of the article. Well, what are you going to do? Basically, the data isn't going to get disclosed to the public if the article isn't published, but the investigator is not going to take the time to write the article unless he or she gets a draft. So the only real right way to do it is you have to go out and hire an independent party and say, could you write the draft? But then you paid them, which is questionable. And can you really make clear to that writer, now, we're paying you, but you really need to be cold about this data. It's just data. You need to write this as a scientific review. It's a tough problem. And I don't think that's there's not an easy solution there. There's not something we can just say, oh, this is the way it ought to happen. Very, very tough. Frank ghostwriting is obviously wrong. It shouldn't happen. Any kind of frank influence that a company tries to put on a publication or a journal is wrong. It really shouldn't happen. And is there some tacit, back to the original issue, is there some tacit influence via advertising revenues? I don't know. I do know one person who was, in fact, the senior editor of a journal, an industry journal, which did carry a lot of advertising for pharmaceutical companies. I used him at one of the companies that I was running as a external PR consultant, specifically for the reason that he quit his job because the owners of the publication came to him and said, you cannot write that editorial, which is negative to our advertisers. And so he said, see you around. And I hired him because that to me meant he was a great writer. And I thought, that's the kind of guy I want. But it didn't happen to me, but I trust this guy. I think he's absolutely right. And he said, this was happening at my journal. This is a well-known journal. It's not a scientific journal. It's an industry publication. But there were scientific articles being published in it. And he said, this happened. Owners of the publication came and said, you can't write negative stuff about, and this was editorial, not scientific, you can't write negative stuff about our customers. So, tough problem.
Yes.
I would love to know more about how you navigate saying no culturally and not burning bridges when they come to you with manufactured data. And have you ever been in danger just by saying no, not even just threatening to report it?
Well, it depends on the place. I guess I'm chicken enough that I'm not. If some powerful Russian investigator says, "Oh, well, I'll manufacture data for you," I'm not going to sit there at the table and say, "Oh, great. Well, I'm calling
Right.
I'm calling the FDA. You know, I have 4 kids. I'm not going to take that risk, I guess. I'm going to report them, but probably once I get back to the U.S. So, in answer to your question, have I ever felt in danger? No, I don't think so, frankly. I worry about my clinical staff, who sometimes are more on the ground in places, and in a couple of situations, we've hired escorts and big people to actually follow clinical staff in certain countries, which is it's kind of nuts. I mean, we're doing clinical trials for medicines. Why should we have to hire bodyguards for physicians or scientists who are going around to coordinate clinical trials? It's pretty crazy. But the first part of your question, when offered that kind of data, is it personally a real challenge? No, I don't. To me, it's not a big deal. It's just there's right and there's wrong.
You just say no.
Yeah, you just don't mess with it. Usually, again, I'm chicken enough sometimes not to say no at the moment. Sitting next to the PI and there's 20 people around a big table in Dalian, China, and the investigator just offered me data, or offered to manufacture the data as the trial goes on. I usually am not going to say, what are you, crazy? I'm out of here. Usually I'll finish the dinner and just kind of and won't go back. We just don't go back. We just kind of, they may send us email, why don't you come back and let's talk about it, and we just kind of, no, I'm not going to do that. And we don't tell them that we reported them. Now maybe that's chicken, but I think they get the idea. Well, it's not, it's not just a question of staying alive. I think that the folks get the message that they tried to do it and we weren't going to go for it. And telling them right there to their face, whether it's dangerous or not, I don't know if it accomplishes a better purpose. But we don't go back. I mean, by we, I mean in companies where I've been involved in, where I'm responsible, the clinical staff always know, whether I'm at the meeting or not with the investigator, they know you walk away. It is not acceptable to have additional discussions with anyone who has even intimated that they would do anything to the conduct of a clinical trial which doesn't rigidly follow the protocol. Because the reality is, I run companies that are doing things that I think are going to be good for patients. I don't run companies because I think that the companies are going to make a lot of money, or it's the patient interest. And so, in fact, if we step outside those bounds, it's patient interest that could potentially get sacrificed. And so, to me, it's quite a clear line. There's no question about it.
If you're running a clinical trial and you're looking at drug dosage to try to invest, and say it's really good for cancer, but you have adverse reaction that's quite deadly, like Stevens-Johnson reaction. And would anyone, not meaning your company, but in general, in reporting of the data, when you're in a foreign country, I sort of have a sense here, but in a foreign country, would you have the same kind of ethical obligation as you would here to report the adverse events in the same way?
The formal regulatory requirements for reporting adverse events are quite different in different jurisdictions. No question about that. But frankly, I think if a company's conducting a global trial and doing clinical trials in other countries, you use the most rigid standards, which are the FDA standards. You just do it. And you do it in every jurisdiction, whether it's required in those jurisdictions or not, so that it's all uniform, the reporting is uniform. Now, there are times when there are things required in other countries that are not required by the FDA, in terms of some data reporting. It's unusual, but if they are, then you do it. But in general, it's the FDA standard that's the most rigid, and so every single site, every single patient should be administered under those. You shouldn't play a game of doing clinical trials in a jurisdiction where the safety reporting requirements locally are not as rigid as the FDA's, and so you don't do it. It's not okay.
Is that what's typically done? I mean, I realize
no.
Maybe a little more ethical than some other companies.
No, I don't think. I know that there are companies that do it and have done it, but in general, I don't think it's that typically done because there's too much fear. if nothing else, I mean, certainly a lot of people know it's wrong. You shouldn't do it, and so they don't. But a lot of folks know that if you do differential reporting of safety data in different jurisdictions because you can get away with it, that depending on the division you're working with at the FDA, the FDA is actually trying to do a good job of protecting the safety of the population, and if they find out about it, they're not going to be happy. It's much better to take a protocol and a clinical trial plan to the FDA that says, we are going to do the reporting of this data, especially the safety information, in a uniform fashion globally. It's much better to do that, and I think the agency will work with you in a much more open way if you do that. It's very clear to the FDA that the company is going to be really, really rigid, sometimes even to its detriment, in the conduct of a clinical trial. I mean, I've had the experience of having the FDA come to regulatory people in my companies and say, we have a disagreement with you. You are over-reporting adverse events. You get to do that, but you're not following industry standard. You are clearly over-reporting adverse events, and we would like you to work internally to see if you can correct this, because you should not be over-reporting adverse events. Now, to me, you should. Anything that's even slightly gray, bam, goes to the FDA right now. And it's not that they don't like it, it's just that in this particular case, they informed us and they said, you're not following industry standard. You probably should really think about following industry standard. They didn't forbid us from doing it. But my point is that I think you set a very rigid plan, you make it clear that you're going to be following very rigid rules, and then you do it. That's the right way to do it. Do some people fudge? I've known of a couple cases where folks have fudged, and they haven't done the safety report. Russia was the main country, a diabetes trial where safety data was not reported using U.S. standards in Russia. And it's not okay. I don't think it's okay. Did patients die because of it? I don't think they did. I don't think there was huge suffering. It wasn't like a Stevens-Johnson in a cancer trial. But still, why not? Why wouldn't you do it? I mean, because a local agency might look at it and somebody would say, gee whiz, let's take a closer look, or let's just hold up here for a while, or slow down your recruiting. No, it's life. And that's the way it goes. So, did that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. What?
Just have a general question. You talked about how important you feel it is to be ethical, to have your company perform ethically. And, if you've got, let's say you've got an issue that's, an ethical issue, it's sort of gray. If you do the wrong thing, you're not going to kill anybody. If you do the right thing, let's say it's going to cost a lot more money or delay your trial. How do you persuade people? What arguments do you find work best? Do you make arguments that appeal to ethics is good for business, or do you simply a sort of a moral argument?
That's kind of a nasty question to answer, to be honest, because it's a little embarrassing.
Take a big stick.
Because I'll be frank about it. In what I do for a living, basically I'm a salesperson, right? I'm selling a pretty complex product in many instances, but I'm a salesman, and that's okay. But many times I have to use different arguments and different sales techniques to convince folks, especially the folks who are paying the bills. Because again, in drug development, very often these are venture-backed companies that lose money for well over a decade. That you're throwing investor money down the drain for over a decade before you know whether it's going to be worth it or not. So for those people that keep funding you, sometimes you have to be pretty creative about how you pose it, and going to them and saying, well, folks, this is the right thing to do. I mean, I have done that and had frank laughter around the board table. So what's news? So it's the right thing to do. So now tell me why is it that we should do this? So in that case, then I have been guilty of crafting arguments very clearly. Sometimes doing a little tear jerking of saying, look what could happen to patients if we don't do this. This is we're all in this business because we're interested in patients, right? Which is of course a lie. Most of the people around the table are interested in this because their job for their companies is to make a bunch of money for their limited partners, and they get a chunk of it. They personally, part of that money goes in their pocket. sitting around the table. So to say to them, well, gosh, look what could happen to patients. But you just get to a point with them, sort of emotionally, where they look bad. Mm-hmm. You have to create the argument in a way that they're going to look bad if they stand up and say, well, screw that. It's going to cost us more money. We don't have to do this. I don't want to do it. You have to get them to a point where the rest of the folks around the table will kind of go, oh man, if somebody does that, stands up and says, no, we're not going to spend that money. So again, it was a tough question to answer because sometimes I've had to craft arguments that I've been they're a little Machiavellian,
Well, if I can just point out, you suggested two sort of ethical theories, which is one is a utilitarian argument, right, that it's just good that there are going to be costs involved. What are the consequences? Are not going to be good. We'll lose business. We'll be on the front page of the New York Times. The second argument is really a deontological argument, right, that there's a duty, that, it is the right thing to do. Regardless of the consequences, it's the right thing.
I actually had a third argument, just maybe you construct some argument that's actually good for your business somehow. Maybe because you don't end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or whatever.
Right, but it's sort of utilitarian in a certain way, or you quote Machiavellian, the same thing. The third, your answer I thought was quite interesting because it really suggests sort of a virtue ethics perspective, which is, you're good people. That guy who's saying that is a schmuck. He's just we're good people. We don't do things like that or whatever it is, but something that you sort of shame them in the sense that, it means that they have no virtue. They're a bad person. I don't know how you'd actually say that, but it was interesting that because there are these different theories of how do you motivate ethical behavior, and these are different examples in practice.
No, I've pulled budget approvals for clinical trials out of people based on shame. I've done that. And do I feel good? Do I feel good about it? No. I don't personally. I don't like it. I would much rather sit at the table and say, folks, this is the right thing to do. We need to do it. We need to spend the extra money to do it this way. And so I'd like you to approve this budget for this clinical trial. And have everyone go, oh, sure. But it doesn't happen. And so if I need to spend, then I have occasionally used shame to get people to do it. But it doesn't make me feel real good. I don't think it's, on my part, I don't think it's very, it's probably better just to be frank and honest and take the consequences if folks will say, no, we're not going to give you the money to do that. Can't do it.
Completely different area. A new, very large industry has come along in the last 30 years called continuing medical education. And until 2 years ago, there's never been bioethicists. David Rothman has turned up a few times, but there's never been bioethics well represented, or nowhere near the very detailed discussion you had today that applies to the pharmaceutical industry. Well, there's been a working relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and CME, which is overwhelming. I come back last week from a meeting in San Francisco where there are 1,800 members of the Alliance for Continuing Medical Education. And until 2 years ago, bioethics wasn't talked about or thought about as being an issue. And the issue is that a certain number, many psychiatrists interestingly from distinguished places, had gotten paid a lot of money, which they did not report to the universities, for getting things published and doing things which are just completely, by what I've been hearing about tonight, things which your industry has been onto for a very long time, and we have not. And I think that we will undoubtedly begin to have people with the backgrounds you have, with the sensitivities you have, and with the legal connections. I'm impressed by how many legally connected people there are around this room, to look at this other big pharmaceutical opportunity to deceive or whatever. Let's take the worst approach to what the pharmaceutical industry might be out to do. They've gotten away with a hell of a lot in the CME industry.
No, they haven't, and that's an issue we didn't discuss. It's an issue that's not being discussed a lot, but clearly the FDA is interested, and there is a lot of discussion going on about it. And you're right, this whole issue of publication and ghostwriting has more focus at the moment, but the fundamental issue of CME, in that if it's related to drugs, is that the sponsorship of the pharmaceutical industry in that CME has been, I mean, pervasive is a very mild word. I mean, it's absolute control.
Almost the only source. Universities don't want to pay for that,
Oh, yeah.
particularly the pharmaceuticals.
Oh, that's exactly right. And you know, are there CME courses that are given that are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies that are quite legitimate and unbiased? Oh, absolutely, I believe there are. But are there courses that are not unbiased? Oh, of course there are. And is the temptation always there? And is the implication always there? But then what do you do if you provide it? If the FDA comes out in 2 years from now when their study group finishes the issue of CME, they come out with a regulation that says pharmaceutical companies can't sponsor CME anymore. Wow, continuing medical education? Wait a second, you just gutted it.
That is approximately happening. And a lot of energy in the alliance is going into saying, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
The door is just being slightly opened.
Yeah, it's similar to this whole issue that's been discussed sometimes even in Congress and certainly in the press about should in fact pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies be paying for clinical trials? Shouldn't the public actually have control of that so that there is not bias introduced, so that the right trials are done and they're done correctly and there's no bias? You know, it should in fact the public in some way pay for continuing medical education instead of the industry. It should be in an ideal world that might be a good thing, but I don't see the money sitting around.
Well, it's very funny because during the Bush years, I remember speaking to someone on Capitol Hill who said, why should we fund the NIH at all? Because if there's going to be a good treatment, it'll earn money, and so why should the government be subsidizing this, what eventually is going to be paid for? So it's like a complete other opposite view.
But then there was an article today, sort of commentary article that came out saying that the FDA is biased and is making improper decisions in favor of drugs that are mainly supported by NIH research. So there's the other flip side of it, is people are now saying, well, wait a minute, the NIH being involved introduces an unfair bias to the FDA in the research. So a company that does a CRADA and basically licenses a compound that's come through NIH research has a much better chance of it being approved than a company that's brought the drug through all the way on its own, even though the data don't speak better for one drug or another. So
let me ask you, so if you were head of the FDA, what would you change, or what?
Very intriguing question. I think that one of the first things that I would do, and some of this is not my opinion, it comes from my dear friend, Dr. Frank Young, who was the last professional commissioner of the FDA, the last person who really actually had the skills to run and was not a political appointee. So he was the last non-political appointee head of the FDA. When he left the FDA, everyone since has been a political appointee. That doesn't mean they're bad, but they're political appointees. So is there an agenda? Well, we talk about ethical bias. Yeah, there's an agenda. And so, some of these things I'm plagiarizing from Frank, who is a phenomenal thinker and a phenomenally ethical person and really thinks about bioethics issues. But I think the first thing I would do is make sure that there were professionals in charge of every division of the FDA, especially the clinical divisions, the Division of Oncology Products, the Orthopedics Division, all of the clinical divisions of the FDA were actually headed by professionals who had a history, whether it's public or private or both, in doing drug development in those areas, so they understood the business, and make sure that every one of them actually were people who personally internalized the idea of bringing good and as safe as possible medicines to the public in the most rapid possible manner, number one. And number two, understood fundamentally the entire system and process of post-approval data collection, and were raising their hand and mandating within their division, we will not under any circumstances tolerate the industry not collecting adequate post-marketing data on approved drugs, whether it's accelerated approval in oncology, and there's a huge controversy about that that came up yesterday because of a meeting of the Oncology Drugs Approval Committee, where the ODAC, Dr. Pazder, again, I have huge respect for him, convened an ODAC not to look at a drug, but to look at the issue of accelerated approvals in oncology, where you may do a single-arm trial with no control, or you may do a very small trial, but then there's a requirement for doing a post-marketing trial. And one of the issues that was discussed is the industry has behaved terribly and doesn't honor its commitments. They just don't do the post-approval trial, or they don't do it in time, or they don't do it right. And that's true. They really don't. And so I think policies will change, but part of the issue here is that, and I'm not criticizing anyone in particular, but if you don't have a real professional who understands the issues and internalizes the issues of post-market data collection, then it's not going to happen. The requirements aren't going to be there. It's not going to be policed adequately. People aren't going to work cooperatively with the industry to make the industry, and this is back to one of our earlier points, understand that it is to the sponsor's benefit to do the post-approval collection if the product was a good product in the first place. So that's one of the first things I do, because I think it could cause a fundamental change in the industry. I think if you did that, you put those people in place and said, you're going to do that starting today. You're going to mandate this. Every trial that's going on, you're going to go back to the sponsors and say, by the way, this is now a rigid new set of things we're going to do. We're going to do post-approval data collection. You're going to do it in the right way. Here are the kind of systems. You're going to show me within a short period how you're going to do that. I think suddenly we'd find a lot of drugs in development stopped. I think there are a lot of drugs that are in the pipeline of a lot of companies that suddenly would disappear from those pipelines, just mysteriously, because the sponsors know that the drugs don't actually have any benefit, any real benefit. And so the sponsors are going to look at it and say, wait a minute, we might get this out on the market, but our costs, we have absolute cost up to the day of approval. We start gaining revenue, but we're not going to profit from the drug until a few years down the road as sales escalate. So they're going to look at their pipelines and say, wait a second, if we're crammed into a very tight, very rigid post-approval data collection, and we actually suspect that the effect of this drug is marginal, then we're going to get killed. We're going to go all the way through approval. We're going to get this approved. We're going to build a sales force. We're going to spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars to launch this drug. And then 2 years later, when we submit that data, we could get killed. If you look at Genentech's drug Avastin, now I can't tell you because I wasn't there. I don't know if there were people at Avastin that knew full well that that drug had no effect on survival for any cancer patient at the time it was first launched. It doesn't. And it's being shown in post-approval studies. But they're selling $6.8 billion a year of it. So they've made their money. But if they had been forced to get that data within 2 years of the approval of the first indication, which means that data would have been available in 2004, would they have developed that drug? Don't know. They shouldn't have. Shouldn't have been developed. Should never have been given to human patients. So, sorry, pretty radical opinion, but I believe that the data is showing that drug never should have been given to human patients.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I don't know if you have a few minutes if people come up to ask other questions, and we all want to thank you very much for a fascinating